Today I wanted to look at how is it possible for there to be poverty in a modern state. All of us who are born in Kenya, we've become very used to the idea of massive poverty amongst almost everyone that we know. In fact, very few people that most of us who ordinary Kenyans know actually are rich. Most people are struggling, and they've always been struggling. Our parents struggled, their parents struggled, everyone that we know struggles financially. Now, I was trying to think about this issue and wondering, isn't it a huge contradiction for there to be poverty in a modern state? And this is what I mean. A modern state is a state that is run on the basis of knowledge and skills. That the people who are running the state are actually presumably qualified to run whatever departments they're running. Now, let's get this straight. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean that they're not inept. But I'm comparing a modern state with an ancient state. I want you to think of the kingdoms that existed 500 years ago. I mean, in those kingdoms, most of the people were not highly educated, because we do know that education, scientific, technical education is a fairly recent thing. And the amount of knowledge within society has increased over time. So that previously, people were running entire states, entire governments, and kingdoms on the basis of very little actual knowledge. They were very knowledge deficient. Yet, within their structures that they created, you didn't have this kind of horrific poverty that we see today. Now, I was wondering, knowledge has increased, which means that we know what needs to happen. It's not a secret. It's not something that is being discovered or researched out. When you look at the older modern nations, when you just study their history, you can see what works and what doesn't work. And in each and every one of these situations, industrialization works. Almost each and every country that has escaped mass poverty has industrialized. And industrialization simply means making for self everything that you can make for yourself. There are basic industries that every nation requires. There are those things that as a people, you must be able to do for yourself. But in the case of a country like Kenya, even those basic industries are non-existent. Even the little things that we can do for self, we do not do for self. So I was wondering, how is it possible for such a situation to coexist with a modern state? Because if you go to the Ministry of Planning, if you go to the Ministry of Finance, we even have a Ministry of Industrialization, if you can believe that. If you go to all these ministries, you'll find that many of the people who work within those ministries are actually qualified to do those jobs. You'll find there are very many universities in Kenya. And that is also a pool of knowledge workers, so that if the government needs additional knowledge resources, they can always call upon the universities to provide that knowledge. And in the universities, you'll find qualified PhDs. They have genuine PhDs. They are actual economists. They are not faking it. They are the real thing. And they're experienced. And they have knowledge. And they have studied other countries. So I want you to think of all these qualified people who are fully trained in how to run an economy. How is it that it escapes them that the only way out of massive poverty is through industrialization? And the way you industrialize, you don't start by making rockets that go to the moon. No, you start by doing simple stuff, not high-tech stuff. And then you grow slowly over time. So one of the most basic fundamental industries that every country needs is a textile industry. You need to be able to make your own clothes and your own shoes as a starting point. And other simple implements like nails, pangas, things of that nature. Now, I want you to think that we don't have a textile industry in Kenya. We have a huge market. We have 45 million people plus. And most people buy clothes, not just one single set of clothes, but multiple sets of clothes. Which means if you have 45 million people, it means that the amount of clothes you need, multiply that by maybe 10 or even 20. Let's just say 10. You need about 450 million pieces of clothes every year. That's a huge market. You can employ almost 200,000 plus people just to provide clothes to this massive market of 45 million people. And we have all these professors in economics, qualified people. How come they cannot see that the country must have a textile industry? How do you explain that? They have the knowledge, but they don't seem to be able to implement that knowledge. How do you explain that? Is it that they don't see the poverty? Is it that they don't see how other countries industrialized? What is the problem? How come there's a disconnect? How can you be a PhD in economics and you end up working at the Ministry of Economic Planning or whatever name you call that ministry, and you're in charge, and somehow you're not able to implement a very simple policy of make your own clothes and shoes as a starting point? So how do you explain the fact that the import regime pursued by the government of Kenya is to allow foreigners to flood the country with used clothing and cheap clothing? How can it be the policy of the government to provide employment to the tailors in China, the tailors in Turkey? How can it be, yet you have a treasury, a Ministry of Economic Planning, a Ministry of Industrialization, all these universities that are full of professors in economics? How come none of all these people are able to see that flooding the country with cheap used clothes creates unemployment and poverty within the country? You see, that's the contradiction that I'm saying. How can you have a modern state run by educated people, experienced people, yet you have tremendous amounts of poverty? That is a contradiction, isn't it? How can it be that 500 years ago, we didn't have the same levels of poverty that we have today? But they argue, they say, oh, well, the population is high. Well, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the population of Kenya was like 10 million. There were not many people. Yet, the poverty levels were even higher. So how do you explain that? Clearly, it's not an increase in population, because even with 10 million people, 70% of them were starving to death, were extremely poor, repeated famines, a lot of destitution, a lot of poverty, school dropping out because of lack of school fees. So how do you explain you have all these trained people, yet the country is incredibly poor? All these brains somehow don't work for us. You know, I always think about things like that, and I'm mystified. You know, sometimes I would love to be able to interrogate the men in charge of the poverty, to ask them, is it that you don't know how to industrialize a country, but you're trained? You're a PhD in economics. You're trained, so you do know. So how do you explain the policies you're pursuing? Because according to your training, flooding the country with cheap imports, especially in areas where the locals can make those things for themselves, creates rampant unemployment. And of course, that creates a lot of poverty and lack of prosperity. And you know, poverty feeds upon more poverty. Poverty generates more poverty, just the same way wealth generates more wealth. So your training tells you not to do that. Is it that you don't have common sense? Then why would you pursue policies against your own training? You know, I always wonder about that. You know, just think, for the entire country of Kenya, if the Chinese said today, we will not sell you underwear, that all the people in Kenya will be walking around with their things hanging, flying all over the place, because the country cannot even make for itself underwear. Can't make for yourself underwear. How do you explain that? How difficult is it to make underwear? Is it really that difficult? Do we not have tailors in the country? Is it difficult to make a shoe? Really? Do we not have shoemakers in the country? Then how do you explain the policy to flood the country with cheap manufactured clothes and kill off a huge employer that would be the textile sector? How do you explain that? We can make blankets, but they flood the country with foreign blankets. So the people of Kenya create a lot of employment for the people of China, who despise them, by the way. They buy a lot of used clothes. You know, when an American dies, his clothes are sold to poor countries like Kenya. So you'll find Kenyans wearing the clothes of dead Americans, dead mzungu, very proudly. And imevaa nguo ya maiti, very proudly. Why would you allow your population to do that? It doesn't do them any good. And it puts you under pressure. It puts you under political pressure, because when you have too many young men idling around, you know, that's a security issue. And that's also a political issue, isn't it? So why would they do that? Why would they pursue policies that their education and training tells them will perpetuate poverty and intensify the poverty? They would only be doing that out of a spirit of malice. What other reason would they have? It has to be malice. Now you have to ask yourself, why would they be malicious against their own people? Well, once you get into government and you begin to meet these people, you'll begin to understand that they only act when they're given instructions from London and Washington. And Washington told them, you must continue to accept our cast-off, our discarded clothes. You must accept them because we have a lot of discarded clothes. So you must accept these clothes. Clothe your people with our discards. Yeah. And they don't protest. They don't say, but that's going to create unemployment. You're going to kill our textile industry. No, they never protest. Why? Because the Mzungu comes first. You understand? So they will go against their training. They will go against their common sense in order to please the Mzungu. Now, what is this hold that the Mzungu has on the brains of the men who rule a country like Kenya? Why do they feel obligated to obey the Mzungu? What is it? Well, from the day they were boys, they were taken to a temple, a church, and they were shown a cartoon picture, a painting, a statue of a Mzungu. And they were told that this is God. They were shown more cartoon paintings and pictures of Mzungus with wings. And they were told that, you see this Mzungu with wings, this is an angel from heaven. So everyone in heaven, they were told, when they were boys, is a Mzungu. There are no Africans in heaven. Yeah, have you ever seen an African in heaven? Every person in heaven is a Mzungu, isn't it? How do we know this? The Mzungu told us. Yeah, he went to heaven, took pictures, and then came back to earth and showed us those pictures. And those pictures were of himself, seated on the throne of God as God. Yeah. Hanging on a tree as the savior of everyone. Saving us from who? From our enemy. Who is our enemy? I guess the Mzungu. So he was saving us from himself. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? And what is bizarre is that even after these men grow up, they cannot seem to shake the idea that the Mzungu is God. And ultimately, that is the downfall of Africa. Because they will make every decision for the benefit of the foreigner. They will never make any decision that would contradict or impede or go against what the foreigner wants. Because ultimately, the foreigner is God. And so this is the challenge that we have. That we have trained men in positions of power who know what to do, but will not do it because it does not please the Mzungu. So how do we resolve this problem? People keep on saying, change the politicians. It makes no difference, because if you go to the street and pick up any African man, any man in Africa at random, any man in Kenya at random, you will get the same brainwashed man. It doesn't matter whether he has a PhD or whether he's a school dropout. He will act in accordance to the instructions given to him by any Mzungu who shows up. Any school dropout Mzungu, crazy Mzungu that shows up in Africa is immediately God in Kenya. Immediately. With no exception. And he can rise very quickly to become an advisor to the government, despite the fact that he dropped out of school. Immediately. He's at the God status. So changing the government, changing the politicians, never helps in Kenya or in Africa. It doesn't matter how many coups happen, how many civil wars happen, how many elections happen, because replacing one brainwashed African man with another brainwashed African man, you get the same result. If he's a standard 7 dropout and he's a PhD, they'll make the exact same decision. So that education doesn't appear to help improve outcomes in Africa. Because the people themselves, the male population itself, is heavily compromised. So ultimately, until you deal with the issue of the worship of European paintings and statues in Africa, you'll never resolve the issue of massive poverty in Africa and the fact that the modern state is unable to tackle poverty, something that should be very, very easy to do given the amount of knowledge that has been accumulated on how to deal with that kind of situation.